Jesus said, there was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs would come and lick his sores. The poor man died and was carried by the angels to be with Abraham. The rich man also died and was buried in Hades, where he was being tormented. He looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. He called out, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in agony in these flames." But Abraham said, "Child, remember that during your lifetime you received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner evil things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. Besides all this, between you and us a great chasm has been fixed, so that those who might want to pass from here to you cannot do so, and no one can cross from there to us." He said, "Then, Father, I beg you to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, that he may warn them, so that they will not also come into this place of torment." Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. They should listen to them." The rich man said, "No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent." He said to him, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone rises from the dead." The Gospel of Jesus Christ.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Please be seated. So I'm going to try this here, but it's dark. And so hang on just a second here. My glasses and this headset are just not friends. I began my night ministry shift at 10 o'clock on a Friday night. The streets and sidewalks near San Francisco's Union Square are abuzz with activity as luxury cars and limousines stop in front of exclusive hotels to drop off or pick up men in their fine suits and women whose expensive gowns and high-heeled shoes require that they move very carefully and take their time. Valets stand ready to help these fabulously or fashionably dressed people from their cars and whisk them inside. On Mason Street, traffic backs up as a limousine pulls abruptly to the curb to disgorge a fur-clad woman whose jewelry flashes and glitters at neck and ears as it catches bright light. A few feet away, an old woman in a dirty pink sweater and mismatched socks digs through a sidewalk trash can looking for something to eat. And just beyond that, 4 men huddle in blankets under old pieces of cardboard in the darkened doorways of a church. The bejeweled woman doesn't see the hungry old woman digging through the garbage or those asleep in the church doorways, because they're obscured by the darkness and the light is pointing in one direction. She sees only what is illuminated by the lights directly in front of the hotel. And without a sideways glance, she allows herself to be escorted through the doors, away from anything unpleasant or offensive. By 2:30, a cold, wet wind has begun to blow, and the streets are empty except for a handful of homeless people too cold to sleep, and a man in a gray suit who's buying a paper from a stand outside the hotel. Tucking his paper under his arm, he turns to me and says with a heavy English accent, "How can this be? I've traveled all over and I've never seen anything like this. There's no need for any of these people to go hungry or to sleep out in the cold. You don't see this in other countries. This country has the resources to take care of these people. Now, I know I'm talking here about San Francisco, but I have to tell you that before I did night ministry in San Francisco, I did night ministry in Seattle. And it's really no different. It's just colder in Seattle. Today's gospel lesson isn't about heaven and hell, life after death, or even resurrection. Rather, it's about compassion and the spiritual danger of blindness to the plight of those who live in poverty. It was intended to confront those who would follow Jesus with what they already knew from the law and the prophets. You know, we tend to assume that often, not all of us, but we often tend to assume that the commandment to love our neighbor came from Jesus, like that was his insight, but actually he got that from Leviticus. So they knew what they were supposed to be doing from their scripture. Jesus tells a parable about a rich man who used to shop at Nordstrom and wear name brand clothing. He ate the finest food and owned all the latest electronic gadgets. And pulling out of his large brick circular driveway in front of his house in his big SUV with tinted windows, he never noticed Lazarus huddled next to the post that held up his electronic gate. But month after month, Lazarus spent his nights in some bushes near the gate and dug through the rich man's garbage for his breakfast. Sleeping outside in the cold and damp, he became so weak he couldn't keep the dogs from licking the sores that covered his body. Like so many street people, Lazarus died. There was no street chaplain. There was no money to pay for his burial. Yet he was taken by messengers from God to the bosom of Abraham and to the comfort of his spiritual family. The rich man also died and was buried. In his torment in the place of the dead, the rich man looked up and saw Abraham a long way off, holding Lazarus in his arms, and he cried out, "Father Abraham, pity me, and send Lazarus over here to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in agony." His torment was so great that he was willing to receive help from a man who was untouchable. My son Abraham replied, "Remember that during your life good things came your way just as bad things came the way of Lazarus. Now he is being comforted here while you are in agony. But that's not all. Between us and you a great gulf has been fixed to stop anyone from crossing from our side to yours or from your side to ours." Across this gulf, this chasm in the place of the dead, the rich man had himself become untouchable. Then, for the first time, the rich man began to show feelings of compassion, but only for his brothers, affluent people who shared his values and way of life. "Father Abraham," he begged, "send Lazarus to my father's house to warn my 5 brothers so they don't end up in this place of torment." But Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them." The rich man argued, "If someone comes to them from the dead, they will be transformed." Then Abraham shook his head and answered sadly, if they won't listen either to Moses or the prophets, they won't be convinced if someone should rise from the dead. This parable is about a man much more affluent, probably than any of us. But Jesus often uses exaggeration in his parables to make a point, and so does Jesus. Yes, this parable is directed at the rich, but wealth is relative. The way Luke tells the story, Jesus seems to have told this particular parable to the Pharisees who still pressed around him as he and his followers made their way to Jerusalem. Now, it's important to know who the Pharisees really were to understand whom it was he was addressing. In ancient Palestine, Pharisees were devout men who tried to do the right thing. They were generally good people held in high esteem in the community. A few may have been quite wealthy, but most were what we would consider middle class, not very different from many of us here this morning. Luke included this parable in his gospel because there were people in the early Christian community who were comfortable with their circumstances and preferred not to look too hard at the situation around them. We've heard Paul address that too, right? Where he gets on the people of Corinth because on Sunday, all the people who don't have to work on Sunday get there early and eat all the food and don't leave anything for the people who have to work and come later. So it's not that they were doing anything against the people living in poverty, just that they chose to ignore the economic disparity and its consequences. Like the rich man in the parable and the fur-clad woman in San Francisco, they chose not to see what was unpleasant. They were able to justify looking the other way because it was generally accepted that those who were well off deserved it, and of course, the corollary to that is that those who were poor, well, they deserved that too. It's very comfortable and comforting for the relatively affluent to believe that those who were poor deserve their fate. That's why people like to talk about welfare mothers and welfare fraud. But Feeding America, the nation's largest anti-hunger organization, estimated that in 2019, 12.5 million children in the United States were food insecure, meaning they often didn't have enough to eat, meaning their mothers often went without so that they could eat something. That's 1 in 6 children. That's a lot of kids. But hunger skyrocketed during the pandemic. In July 2020, a team of researchers determined that 18 million children, 1 in 4, were experiencing food insecurity at least some of the time. Good data aren't available for the number of hungry children in our country now. But whether it's 1 in 6 or 1 in 4, it's far too many. In the parable, Jesus is quite clear. There's nothing in the parable Jesus told to suggest that there were any differences between the rich man and Lazarus, except that one was rich and one was poor. Nothing to indicate that one was good and the other evil, that one was wise and the other foolish, that one went to church and the other one didn't. They were simply two people, one rich and one poor. The God of Moses and the God of the prophets, the God of Jesus and Luke, the God of the rich and the poor, our God, is creative and generous by nature. And God has made us in God's own image to be creative and generous. When we live contrary to the creative, generous nature that reflects God's image, we feel unfulfilled, empty, and ultimately tormented by the gulf that arises between us and Father Abraham, who is unable to reach across the gulf to comfort us. We live in a society in which personal wealth is determined by one's assets. An old bumper sticker sums up the prevailing American philosophy: the one who dies with the most toys wins. Do you remember that one? It's no wonder that people today are so desperately seeking spiritual fulfillment. And too often, popular preachers are quick to rush in to fill the void by picking popular sins to rail against. ignoring greed and the plight of those who live in poverty. But those are the sins that the prophets talked about and that Jesus talked about over and over and over again. The rich man in this story never did realize that his torment and the gulf that developed between him and Abraham, his religious father, his spiritual father, resulted from his failure to recognize the connection between his own self-centeredness and Lazarus' poverty. The rich man's sin was not a sin of commission. It was a sin of omission. Even from the place of the dead, the rich man felt entitled. He saw Lazarus as one who should be serving him. He looked out, and here Lazarus is being comforted by his spiritual father for all this time he suffered. And what does the rich guy want? He wants Lazarus to leave that place of comfort and go to my brothers and you take care of them, Lazarus. He failed to recognize Lazarus as a seventh brother, another child of Father Abraham, a beloved child of God. He failed to show compassion. Throughout the Bible, we find God's radical reversal of common social values. There's a preferential bias for those who are poor over those who are rich, weak over strong, humble over proud, child over adult, and so on. Jesus invites us to recognize the rich man in ourselves, to become aware of the plight of those who are poor and act on it. We hear the echo of Abraham's words, "You have Moses and the prophets. Listen to them." In 2019, these are the years for which there's data. In 2019, more than half a century after President Johnson declared war on poverty, 12.6% of Tacoma residents had incomes below the official poverty line. In 2021, the poverty threshold in the United States was $26,246 for a family of four, 12.6%. But the percentage of those who live in actual poverty is much higher yet. Most grant writers on the West Coast don't even bother talking about the official poverty line or poverty level. Instead, when we write grants, we talk about twice the official poverty level as being very low income. I looked it up in Tacoma. A family of four is considered extremely low income at $30,450, very low income at $50,750, and low income at $81,200, largely because the cost of housing is so high. So, of course, someone who lives in a house that's paid for and is maybe one of a couple can get by on that kind of income a lot better than a family of four who's renting. So as I read this, I wonder, who is Lazarus to this congregation? Who are the people we don't see, whose plight we don't notice? This congregation cares for children and families through the food bank and through its ministries to the children at Harvard Elementary School. And the thing is, Jesus calls us to open our eyes and go deeper, to see more. Not just what are we doing now, but what am I not seeing? In light of Jesus' parable, what is God calling this congregation to do and be now? What direction is God intending to tug this congregation in? In the parable, Abraham said to the rich man, "If the rich do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone rises from the dead." But the thing is, we hear those words in light of our knowledge that Jesus is risen, that we may transform and be transformed. Jesus bids us recognize Lazarus as our brother. And so we come with Lazarus and Abraham to the family table to share in the feast of all the saints, poor and rich, of every age, that we may be strengthened for service in our life together.